Welcome to the Michigan Department of Education's Teaching Comprehensive History webinar series. I am Scott Koenig, a social studies consultant with the Michigan Department of Education. We promote and encourage teaching the rich and diverse history of our country and world. The presentation you will see today intends to provide educators additional perspectives, knowing that as educators expand their knowledge, they will be better able to create lessons that help students meaningfully engage with history. We are proud to partner with institutions of higher education, cultural centers, and the Confederation of Michigan Tribal Education Departments, bringing their research and expertise directly to Michigan educators. Today, we are fortunate to welcome Dr. Isabel Montemayor-Vazquez. Isabel Montemayor-Vazquez, who will share her history about the Bracero Program. Teaching comprehensive history webinars are intended to lift the knowledge of educators so that in turn, you may provide opportunities for students to inquire, think critically, and explore history from multiple perspectives you may have not heard before. As you listen today, you are encouraged to consider how this content and perspective could be incorporated to enhance learning in your community. It is my pleasure to introduce Dr. Isabel Montemayor-Vazquez. She holds a Ph.D. in Cultural Anthropology from Michigan State University. Her research has focused on how health and immigration policies in the United States and Mexico impact mixed status families' daily lives and health in Mid-Michigan and Eastern Michoacan, let me try that again. Michoacan. She currently serves as Executive Director of the Hispanic Latino Commission of Michigan, where she is charged for guiding the work of the commission to advise the governor and legislator on pertinent issues impacting the Latinx community in Michigan. Welcome, Dr. Montemayor-Vazquez.
Well, thank you so much. It's a pleasure to be here today. And Scott, we gave you a mouthful. We gave you a lot of very difficult words to pronounce, and I'm sorry about that. First and foremost, I do just want to extend a thank you to Scott for working with me on making sure that we could get this presentation up and running today. And then also I wanted to acknowledge Dr. Renee Garcia, who works with the Michigan Department of Education, for reaching out to me to present today to all of you. And finally, to Superintendent Dr. Rice for encouraging the education of full, robust, and inclusive American history. Additionally, I'd like to share that all of the images used today were taken by photographer Leonard Nadel, a freelance photographer hired by the Fund for the Republic, which was an anti-McCarthy spinoff of the Ford Foundation. And he was hired to document through photography the Bracero Program. The over 2,000 images consist of pictures documenting life in Mexico, the Bracero processing procedures in Mexico and the US, and life of Braceros while working, and then the conditions of that work and their living conditions that they experienced as well. Without these photographs, much of the history of the Braceros would have been lost over time or erased or not documented at all. So once again, my name is Isabel Montemayor-Vazquez. Pleasure to be with all of you. Some of my background as a former professor and research associate with the Center for Mexican American Studies focused on different bilateral agreements between Mexico and the United States. So I have spoken to my students in the past and in other presentations quite extensively about the Bracero Program. Go ahead and go to slide 2. Today, we will cover some important questions. And one of those first questions is, what is a bracero? And why is the Bracero Program, or why are braceros important to me? So you all who are watching this presentation. And what was or were the Bracero programs or program? And why did the programs emerge? What were the provisions of the programs included in the contracts? And finally, why did the program end? Hopefully by the end of today's presentation, you'll be able to take away answers to some of these questions, and perhaps you'll have questions of your own. So slide number 3, please. The term bracero comes from the Spanish word brazo, or arm, and literally means he or she who works with their arm. It can also be loosely translated to a farmhand, or somebody who works on a farm with their arms. Learning about the Bracero program is important because it teaches us about international relations, specifically international relations with our neighbor to the south, Mexico. It highlights an often forgotten history that contributes greatly to our current agricultural landscape. And the Bracero program, most importantly, teaches us about the human element, how humans are involved in bilateral treaties and agreements. So how humans are both critically, directly, and indirectly impacted in macro level policy. Slide number 4, please. So according to the Bracero History Archive, the Bracero program, or the Mexican Farm Labor Program, as it is officially known, grew out of a series of bilateral agreements between Mexico and the United States. So we often say the Bracero program, but there were several Bracero programs, and I'm going to talk about them today. These programs essentially allowed millions of Mexicans, mainly men, to come to the United States to work on short-term, primarily agricultural labor contracts. The first program began in 1917, and then the second program, which had 2 large phases, ended in 1964. So in total, we're talking about from 1917 to 1964. The second Bracero program, which is the focus of my presentation today, started in 1942, and then, as I mentioned, it ended in 1964. In total, it resulted in 4.6 million signed Bracero contracts. Many individuals who came to the United States as braceros returned several times, signing multiple contracts. So while there were millions of people involved, it was over 4.6 million signed contracts. The Bracero program was the largest U.S. contract labor program in our history. The specific aim of the program was to fill labor shortages in agriculture and railroads during World War II and immediately after the war. Mexican workers were recruited in Mexico under short-term contracts to work in the U.S. under regulated conditions. And the contracts promised specific wages, specific working conditions, adequate housing, food, and as well as other provisions to the workers. According to historian Erasmo Gamboa, braceros mainly worked in California and Texas, but there were pockets across the US and even a significant population of braceros in the Pacific Northwest. I had the opportunity to take a course at Michigan State when I was in graduate school with Dennis Valdez. And Dennis Valdez is a Chicano Latino studies scholar and historian from MSU. And he traced the presence of braceros to the Great Lakes region, including Michigan as well. Millions of Mexicans over the 22-year formal bracero period worked mainly in stoop crops. Stoop crops are crops that require the harvester to be stooped down low and hunched over for extended periods of time. Among the stoop crops picked by the braceros were cotton, beets, lettuce, asparagus, and various other crops. You can go ahead and go to slide 5. The program helped fill critical labor gaps in agriculture as well as railroads during and after World War II, when there were labor shortages due to military service as well as other factors. At the end of World War II, agriculture was changing also. No longer were we feeding the country through small family farms. The onset of agribusiness and commercial farms demanded more manual labor, which led to the sustainability of the Bracero program for additional years. The Bracero program played a crucial role in maintaining agricultural productivity and supporting the U.S. economy during a period of rapid growth and development. The program facilitated significant migration from Mexico to the U.S., influencing cultural and demographic shifts that we should also keep in mind. It also had lasting effects on U.S.-Mexico relations and immigration policy throughout the 20th and 21st century. Most significantly, the Bracero program brought to light issues of labor rights and worker exploitation. Despite formal agreements, many workers faced poor working and living conditions, sparking discussions about labor laws and enforced protections. Finally, the program's end led to changes in U.S. immigration policy and influenced subsequent labor migration trends and policies, leaving a complex legacy in the U.S. and Mexico. Echoes of the Bracero program can be felt in both countries to this day. You can go to slide number 6. So author Juan Garcia gives a succinct overview of the Bracero program history, and this is useful for educators in the Latin American Oxford Encyclopedia. In the early 1900s, border crossings between Mexico and the United States for work and pleasure were fairly regular and without structured surveillance. At that time, there was no border patrol. Many Mexicans came to the US to escape political, economic, and social tensions that emerged during and after the Mexican Revolution, which began in 1910 and ended in 1920. Over time, some growers in the Southwest especially began to depend on Mexican labor to work their fields during the first 2 decades of the 20th century. When the U.S. entered World War I in 1917, an agreement with Mexico began, which allowed growers in the U.S. to contract Mexican labor to work in their fields to fill the gaps felt by farmers due to war-related labor shortages. From 1929 to 1939, the Great Depression catapulted the world into economic upheaval, and jobs in manual labor began to diminish. According to Natalia Molina's Borders, Laborers, and Racialized Medicalization, Mexican workers at that time were scapegoated as drains on the U.S. economy and considered cultural outsiders. Dust bowlers, made their way to California in search of work in the fields to find that many farms were relying on Mexican labor, especially because of their cost effectiveness. According to anthropologist Leo Chavez, the Mexican threat narrative was prominent at that time, as Americans wanted to secure work for their families during the Depression, and Mexicans were viewed as threatening American jobs. In response, the United States, in collaboration with the Mexican government, began a process of forcibly removing Mexican nationals and their children and Mexican Americans and sending them to Mexico. It's estimated that 1.6 million Mexican nationals and many U.S. citizens of Mexican lineage were gathered up and forcibly removed, deported, or sent back to Mexico during the 30s. Ironically, the outbreak of World War II again caused labor shortages in the U.S. agricultural industry. Only this time, we saw it on a much greater scale. Thousands of men who would normally fill farm labor jobs were enlisted in the military, or they chose to leave the farms and find work in wartime manufacturing jobs. Those manufacturing jobs provided better pay for these individuals. One of the US government's responses to the problem of gaps in labor due to the war was forming the Bracero Program, or the Mexican Farm Labor Program, as it's officially known. So this Mexican Farm Labor Program, the second Bracero Program, officially began in 1942. In June of 1942, Mexico declared war on the Axis of Powers after two vessels, Mexican vessels, were sunk by German submarines. So Mexico agreed to the first official bilateral agreement during World War II, 1942 to 1949, in an effort to contribute to the Allied forces and for Mexico's economic benefit. During this program, Mexican workers were allowed to legally work on farms in the United States on short-term contracts. Those contracts were usually approximately 6 months, and they could be renewed. The Mexican government saw the program as an opportunity for Mexican farmers to learn more agricultural skills that they could take back to their home country. They also saw it as a benefit for Mexico because individuals could work in the United States and send remittances back, and that would eventually assist the Mexican economy. In addition to supplying a strong labor force to fill jobs that would otherwise go unfilled, the US saw the program as an opportunity to mend sour relations between Mexico and the United States that had ensued due to the forced removals of Mexicans during the 1930s. According to Bracero researcher Philip Martin, the US Department of Labor required farmers who wanted to hire braceros to get certification from the local employment service office that there were not enough US workers to fill the particular jobs. Braceros were then recruited in Mexico by Mexican officials and the United States Public Health Service, the War Manpower Commission, and the Farm Security Commission. Braceros were required to pass a health screening in Mexico, developed by the US military. According to one oral history interview found in the Bracero History Archive with former Bracero Amadeo Tapia, he states, upon crossing into the US, braceros were often transported by cattle car to be screened again. The contract signed by the braceros promised a minimum wage, which was often set at a rate comparable or slightly below US labor standards at the time. The contracts promised employers would provide adequate housing for braceros, often in the form of company-owned housing. The contracts in many cases required that employers provide meals or meal allowances. The contracts also promised transportation from Mexico to the US and back once the contracts were completed, and those were to be paid for by the employers. The contracts promised basic medical care and emergency health services, and finally, they promised certain working conditions and safety standards. Many of these promised items or provisions varied from contract to contract, and adherence and enforcement varied as well during this time period. On the next slide, you'll see part of one of these contracts. Slide 8. This copy of the continuation of the standard work contract from 1957 shows the general terms of agreements, such as lodging and insurance in both English and Spanish. The contract explains that the lodging should be hygienic, not overcrowded, provided by the employer, should be adequate to the specific climate in the area, and paid for by the employer. Additionally, the employer was to provide a mattress or cot when necessary, along with a blanket if necessary. The contract reads, quote, sanitary facilities to accommodate them shall also be furnished by the employer, end quote. The insurance provided to the workers is described in the contract as including death, injury, and disease caused by work during the contract. The employer would pay $1,000 upon the death of a worker, $1,000 upon the loss of both eyes, $1,000 upon the loss of a foot and one hand, and $50 for the loss of a digit, such as a finger, and $25 for partial loss of a digit. What the contract does not include, however, is a provision of insurance after the contract was complete, like long-term health insurance for chronic conditions that could develop as a result of the work or the living conditions months or years later. This contract was a part of the full processing of each worker. The next photographs that you're going to see document the rest of the process from Mexico into the US. Slide 9, please. In this first photo, you see braceros getting vaccinated. And the processing began by getting recruited in Mexico. And once accepted, the braceros had to undergo testing and vaccinations in Mexico, which would be followed by further medicalization at the border and then on the US side. You can see in this picture the amount of people that are waiting in line to be vaccinated by Mexican nurses and American nurses. Slide 10, please. In this photo from 1957, you see hundreds of braceros getting fingerprinted at the processing center in Hidalgo, Texas. This is the point where contracts were presented to the workers and were ultimately signed by the workers. Slide 11, please. In this next picture, you see braceros being fumigated. Braceros were searched for weapons. So they were searched for marijuana and other contraband, and they were then fumigated. Leonard upon crossing over, interview with Amadeo Tapia found in the Bracero History Archive recounts the medical exam braceros underwent in Mexico and then again the US. Mr. Tapia states, quote, "I was embarrassed having to be nude in front of thousands of people," end quote. In another oral history, Saturnino Gonzalez Diaz explains, a former bracero, explains in detail his experience at the Empalme, Sonora Processing Center in 1962. He states, quote, "Your hands were checked to see if they were rough. People with rough hands were allowed to go through. The inspectors would check your muscles, your arms, your legs to see if you could endure. They would make sure you hadn't had any surgeries. Then, if selected, they would take you through to a lane, and there was a man standing above with a hose around his neck and another with a hose around his waist. They would pull you and shove the hose down your trousers and then again at the base of your neck to spray you with the famous fumigation to get rid of parasites and lice, even if you didn't have lice. Then they would take you and 5 or 6 other men, like animals, and put them in a corral for an hour while the white powder stayed on you. After that, you were allowed to shower. And once all clean, they would give you a sandwich and they would put you on a bus to Calexico," end quote. Natalia Molina, a researcher who focuses on the intersection of public health threat narratives and their intersection with immigration policies, argues in her 2011 article that while Mexicans were stigmatized as harbingers of disease and inspected, tested, and fumigated, they were then put in substandard working and living conditions, which contributed to chronic disease like tuberculosis. According to Molina, quote, "Recent scholarly works, along with other sources, such as newspaper articles and previously untapped oral interviews, combined to support the conclusion that health policies that were central to the Bracero program continued to regard Mexicans as health threats rather than critically examining systemic inequalities created and maintained by the Bracero program." Slide 12, please. In this photo, the braceros are gathered into cattle cars and are taken to the Bracero camp where they will work their contract. So much like the oral history who said they were treated like animals, you can see in this picture that they were actually placed on cattle cars and transported like cattle. Slide number 13, please. Ernesto Galarza's book, Merchants of Labor, which is a very important book on the Bracero program, which really recounts everything that happened to the Braceros and really was one of the first books to point out some of the poor working conditions and living conditions of the Braceros, along with Gilbert Gonzalez and Vivian Price's documentary, Harvest of Loneliness, and the journal article by Manuel Espinosa, the Bracero Program, The Impact of Immigration on the American Farm Labor Market, provide robust timelines of what happened and how the program expanded, diminished, and ultimately ended. The first phase, as you can see the phases drawn out here, the first phase, as previously mentioned, was a call to fill labor shortages due to the outbreak of World War II. And the focus was initially agricultural labor to increase food production during difficult times. During the second phase, post-war economic growth led to an increased demand for manual labor. In 1951, the US and Mexico renewed and expanded the program with the Bracero Program Agreement and Public Law 78, which extended the program and increased the number of workers allowed into the US. This really formalized the Bracero Program in 1951. The program began to include non-agricultural labor sectors such as railroad work and construction, reflecting a broader range of labor needs here in the United States. Wages were also to increase from 30 to 50 cents, where they had begun at the start of the Bracero program, to 75 cents. However, there were variations based on the employers and type of work. Between 1952 and 1954, the program faced increasing criticism due to the poor working conditions, the low wages, and exploitation of workers. This led to various labor strikes and protests. In response to the criticism, the US made some changes to improve conditions, but many issues remained for the Braceros. Between 1955 and 1960, the program underwent several reforms aimed at addressing worker grievances and improving conditions for the workers. The administrative and logistical complexity of the program also increased, with growing numbers of workers and more intricate regulations. By the early 1960s, the economic conditions that had created the need for the Bracero program were changing. Technological advancements in the agricultural industry, shifts in the labor market to service and industrial sectors, labor union advocacy, especially by the UFW against the Bracero program because it created unjust wages for other farm workers here in the United States. Public sentiment about the poor working conditions and mistreatment of Mexican workers due to media reporting, photography, like the photographs that you're seeing today by freelance photographers, and Mexico's overall dissatisfaction with the treatment of their nationals all contributed to the end of the Bracero program. The program officially ended on December 31st, 1964, following the expiration of the last agreement. You can go to slide 14. The program had a great impact on US agriculture. For instance, the program provided a steady supply of labor for US agriculture when labor shortages were acute during the war. Braceros helped ensure the continuation of agricultural production and farm operations. With Braceros, US farms could maintain high levels of productivity. Their work allowed expanded cultivation as well as higher yields, ultimately contributing to the growth of the ag sector here in the United States. The availability of inexpensive Bracero labor helped reduce production costs overall for farmers at the time. This was particularly important in crops that required extensive manual labor, such as fruits and vegetables. Many farmers and ag businesses became economically dependent on bracero labor. This reliance influenced labor practices and farm management decisions during the program and deep into the present, according to Philip Martin's Bracero 2.0. You can go to the next slide, slide 15. So the Bracero program had a deep impact on agriculture, as I just explained, but the Bracero program also had a deep impact on the individuals involved, the Braceros themselves. And I've mentioned a few times here that they endured some difficult working conditions, difficult living conditions. And I'm going to show you a series of photographs in a little bit that will confirm this. But in this picture, you see braceros sitting on the edge of a field, and they're eating their lunch in the dirt. They're literally eating their food amongst the crops that they're picking all day long. So their food is sitting in the dirt, and they are sitting on top of crops that have pesticides probably sprayed on them, and they're exposed to those elements. So these are not sanitary conditions to be eating in, to have your food sitting on the floor and be eating off of a plate that's, you know, sitting on top of dirt. But this was often the case for many of the workers because they didn't have much time to eat, and the job was a very hurried job. They were often under great pressure to get the work done and completed very fast. You can go to slide 16. Many braceros encountered poor working and living conditions that violated the terms of their contracts. This included inadequate housing, lack of proper sanitation, and insufficient food. Employers often failed to meet the stipulated standards for worker accommodations and safety. Contracts promised specific wages and benefits, but the employers frequently did not adhere to the terms of the contracts. In some cases, braceros had deductions from their wages that they were unaware of for food, transportation, and other things outlined in their contracts as to be paid by the employer, which in turn negatively impacted their overall earnings. While braceros were in the United States, there were also waves of undocumented workers that came into the United States. For fear of losing their jobs, braceros often would not complain about certain contract violations because there were competing groups of individuals at the time, undocumented farm laborers who were also working in the crops. Some braceros were paid less than agreed upon, or their wages were unlawfully withheld. According to Galarza's Merchants of Labor, his book, Merchants of Labor, recruiters sometimes misled braceros about the nature of the work, the living conditions, and the wages that they would potentially earn. Therefore, many of the workers arrived under false pretenses and were surprised by the working and living conditions that they were exposed to. There were instances where transportation arrangements from Mexico were poorly managed or delayed, causing issues with timely placement of workers. In other cases, employers would not pay for the bracero's return to Mexico. And with no money, the bracero was then stranded in the United States and left to their own devices to find their way back to Mexico. Disputes often arose over contract terms, leading to legal battles. The Mexican consulates and US government were often involved in trying to rectify the issues, but enforcement of the provisions was usually inconsistent and very laxed. This lack of oversight meant that many employers didn't face consequences for their violations and continued to violate the contracts over and over again. Braceros and their advocates organized strikes and protests to demand better working conditions and adherence to contract terms. but many braceros chose not to strike out of fear of retaliation, of losing their contract, losing their job, or being deported. The advocacy efforts highlighted widespread abuses and pressured authorities to address the issues. In some cases, braceros took legal action against employers or the US government for failing to uphold contract terms. But these cases were often very challenging to resolve because it was usually one person's word against another. You can go to slide 17. In this photo, you see how cramped the living quarters were. In many cases, braceros slept in barracks with minimal natural light, often no electricity. They had dirt floors in many cases and had little to no space. In some cases, braceros slept in tents for the duration of their contracts. And Leonard Nadel has many pictures of the different types of camps that braceros lived in during their different contracts. Outhouses were often provided as bathrooms. You can go ahead and go to slide 18. For this picture, the original caption read, this is what Leonard Nadel originally captioned this photo with. This drafty barn was hastily converted into housing facilities for braceros near Stockton, California. One dirty mattress and one blanket was all that was provided for bedding. So you can see that the braceros in some cases were exposed to the elements. Temperatures could go very low at night and they could reach over the hundreds during the day. And there was no air conditioning, obviously, at that time, no heat. So they were kind of left open to the elements in some of those situations. Slide 19. In one oral history with Ramon Flores, in one oral history with Ramon Flores Gonzalez, a former bracero, Mr. Flores Gonzalez recounts how the working conditions were difficult in 1956 California. But what was most striking about his oral history was how he recounts about the challenges in the living conditions. He states, quote, "There was no electricity in the barracks, and we had no bathrooms either. The Bracero program made me suffer many injustices, but I'm happy to have been able to better my life and the life of my family." In this photo, you see the various individuals who live in the wooden shack, who live in this particular wooden shack during their contract. There are no power lines leading to this shack. And in additional photos that Leonard Nadel provides at this particular site, which I didn't include here, but can be found on the Bracero History Archive, the braceros can be seen washing their clothes and their dishes outside, and in some cases in the neighboring river. Slide 20, please. The original caption for this photo from 1956 by photographer Leonard Nadel read, "This is housing provided by a Texan farmer for 200 braceros in this long building with the beds made out of stretched canvas, both on the upper level and the lower level." So you can see in this picture that at first, when you look at it, where the posts are, you think that that's one bed for one individual, but it's actually for two people. And you can see, if you look at it closely, there are two individuals laying side by side there, and underneath there would be two other individuals. And such close living conditions make for the high incidence of respiratory illnesses among the braceros, Nadel explained in the caption for the photo. Braceros endured humiliating processing conditions, as I explained earlier. They also endured long hours of arduous work with little reprieve and unsanitary working and living conditions in cramped spaces that could reach over 100 degrees. When braceros were no longer needed, they were expected to return to their home country. And in many cases, they had no economic assistance to do so because employers did not keep to the contract provisions. The Bracero program serves as a perfect case study for understanding an important piece to a complex history of Mexican migration and managed labor history. Slide 21. So while this was a brief historical overview of the Bracero program, focusing on when it took place, how the program developed, and who was involved, I hope that you were able to take away that there were great benefits from this program for agriculture in the United States at a time of great labor shortage. But we should keep in mind that while there was a benefit to the United States in the agricultural sector, simultaneously there was great criticism of the program because of the problems in broken contracts from employers, poor working and living conditions, and kept wages, among many other factors. Overall, the program contributed greatly to how the United States continues to operate the agricultural sector today, with one of their biggest assets being foreign manual labor. In my next presentation, I'm going to speak more about the legacy of the Bracero program and how the program really laid the foundations for many current immigration policies in the United States. I want to thank you for your time and would like to speak a little bit about some resources now. I'd like to direct educators to the Bracero History Archive. It's an online resource and it provides age-appropriate lesson plans and activities tied to learning about and understanding the Bracero program. The archive also provides a robust list of educational sources and references that document various aspects of the Bracero program. The photos shared today are all part of that particular archive and are able to be used in presentations to educate people about the conditions that braceros endured. You'll also find other documents that are very useful, like the sample contract that I gave, as well as identification cards and other documents that braceros had to sign and utilize during the Bracero program. You'll also find recordings and transcripts of oral histories, some in Spanish, some in English, and you or your family can even contribute to the archive if your family has ties to the Bracero program. Finally, I want to share that there is a young adult historical novel called Esperanza Rising by the author Pam Munoz Ryan. And I think it's a great piece that speaks to some of the issues that I brought up today. This particular piece of work is about a 13-year-old Mexican girl and her plight to the United States in search of work on a farm during the Depression and during a time when Mexicans were forcibly removed from the US. It talks a great deal about the scapegoating of Mexicans by dust bowlers and how there was great tension between the different workers in the fields at that time. I really hope that you'll consider it in your teaching, consider that piece of work in your teaching. And once again, I want to thank you for your time. And I hope I was able to shed some light on an important history that's often excluded from history books.
This was wonderful. Thank you, Dr. Montemayor-Vazquez, for presenting this. And so, but I have a few questions. We have time for questions today. So this is wonderful. And throughout your presentation, you share really the mistreatment of braceros coming into the United States to work. And a question that is coming up is did Braceros use, how did they cope with really the mistreatment and day to day? Because these are long working periods of time and really survival. And so did Braceros, what was used to cope through such unique conditions?
Yeah, they really relied on each other. They relied on their cultural traditions. In some of the photographs by Leonard Nadel, you can see that they would gather and play music. They would tell stories to keep each other, kind of company during the time. They would maintain communication via letter to their family members, in Mexico that they've left behind. And the sheer motivation, right, in many of the oral histories that are available on the archive, the resounding kind of experience by the Braceros was that they were doing this with the hope of bettering their life and the life of their family members behind in Mexico. So that motivation was really kind of what helped them cope on a daily basis. There, historically speaking, we see that people did get tired of the conditions. At a certain point, many of the workers started to strike and started to fight back, if you will, about the working conditions and the broken contracts. So many of them did kind of step up and say, these are unjust conditions and something should be done about it. As I mentioned, others chose not to for fear of retaliation from their employers. Others chose not to participate in those strikes because they wanted to continue working. And even if, things were being kept from them or held, they wanted to continue working.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense to say this is enough. And but you don't see that, you don't read that, right? It's not out there necessarily. So it's great to hear based on your research. Another question coming in asking is, you shared some resources to finish, and is any of the information found in public libraries so that it can be checked out of the actual library, shared with students, or even students, I would imagine, being able to check out this information?
Yeah, I would imagine that several of the resources that are found in the on the Bracero History Archive, there's a long list of resources. I would imagine that several of those are available in public libraries. If not, they can probably be rented out through interlibrary loan from university libraries. A lot of the work was done by professors, so researchers at the university level. So anybody has access to the information, obviously, but they probably are housed in different types of libraries, and you would just have to access them through interlibrary loan.
So we have time for about two more questions, if hopefully that's okay.
Yeah,
And
yeah.
perfect. And so the first of the two questions is, in a lot of the images, we see men, right? We essentially men. And so can you help shine some light on what it might have been like for the women and children as these men left home and were many miles away?
Yeah, so there's a wonderful book. It's actually a dissertation. I'm trying to remember the author's name. My apologies. I think it's actually even in the list of my resources, but it's called Flexible Families, and it speaks specifically about that, how roles were reversed for a lot of the women whose husbands and partners had come up to the United States to work as braceros. Leaving behind a woman or a wife and children often made that wife take on the role of head of household once the husband was in the United States. So not only were they rearing children, but they were really making decisions about the household and holding down the fort, if you will, at home. And that's something that was quite different than what many of the women were used to. Um, but the sacrifices that the women and children made were in combination with the sacrifices that their husbands were making, all in an effort to have a better life. In my next presentation, I'll talk a little bit about how migration patterns between the United States and Mexico really started to change after the Bracero Program. And that has a lot to do with these kind of split families. So, you know, decades later, we started to see a change in migration into the United States. And no longer was it solely men, but women started venturing north as well.
Yeah, that's it's a unique perspective. I don't think that's thought about a lot when it comes to this history, and it was a great question. Any idea on what the average rate of pay might have been for the workers? I'm assuming from farm to farm it may have been different.
Yeah,
But,
it really was different from farm to farm. 30 to 50 cents was what it began at, you know, when the Bracero program started. And then in 1951, it went up to 75 cents. And, you know, sometimes that was different because an employer may say, you know, we're paying you this base rate for your day's work. But in addition to that, if you're able to, you know, pick 100 pounds of cotton, you know, today for however many pounds of cotton you pick in a day, you'll get paid a certain wage. So that's why the wages would change from contract to contract and farm to farm. But they were significantly lower than the average rate at that particular time for a farm labor hand here in the United States. And that's why it was so lucrative and really sought after by a lot of farmers, because they were paying these individuals wages that were significantly lower.
so Dr. Garcia and myself were also kind of thinking alike in this final question to finish our webinar today. And it really is around kind of the extension. So I'm wondering if this kind of clues into the next presentation, but around the Bracero program's influence on today's society, for example. So, you know, and then to tackle that thinking, you know, was modern technology part of the reason for the end of the Bracero program, if we could say end of the program?
Yeah, so modern technology, technological advances in agriculture, especially like in cotton, definitely contributed to the formal end of the Bracero program of 1942 to 1964. That's when that particular program ended. As you mentioned, and you know, as we'll see in the next presentation, there have been many other forms of labor contracts between Mexico and the United States that have come about after that. And there have been great changes and much more oversight in such labor in those labor contracts. But the people are still often, you know, from the same area, from Mexico. So there are certain parts of it that are still very similar to what we saw during the formal Bracero program, but there have been some changes.
Well, the audience, on behalf of the Teaching Comprehensive History webinar team, we thank you, Dr. Montemayor-Vazquez, for your presentation. This work is important to Michigan's educators and leaders as it provides support for teaching comprehensive history within our classrooms. We sincerely appreciate you expanding our understanding from a historical perspective. We appreciate everyone for attending today. We look forward to seeing you in the next week's webinar on Wednesday.